The night was heavy with silence, the kind that pressed against the skin like a warning. The air smelled of damp earth and distant rain, but Manuel Rivas barely noticed. He stood at the edge of his farm, hands resting on the worn wooden handle of his machete, his sharp gaze fixed on the horizon. A man of the land, he had spent years tending to these fields, carving a life out of the soil with nothing but sweat and resilience. Then, the distant hum of engines broke the night's peace. Headlights sliced through the darkness as a convoy of black SUVs approached. The sight alone was enough to set his instincts on edge. Luxury vehicles like those had no business on a humble farm unless they carried trouble. The cars rolled to a stop, doors opened in unison, and a group of well-dressed men stepped out. At the center of them stood Rodrigo Santamaria, a name whispered with both admiration and fear. A powerful businessman with deep political ties, he had built an empire on ambition and ruthless efficiency. And now his eyes were set on Manuel's land. "You have a beautiful farm, Señor Rivas," Santamaria said, his voice smooth as polished steel. "I'd like to make you an offer." Manuel didn't move. He had expected this moment. He knew men like Santamaria, men who believed everything had a price, but some things weren't for sale. What Santamaria didn't know was that Manuel Rivas was not just a simple farmer. Beneath the weathered hands and quiet demeanor lay a past shrouded in secrecy. A past that had prepared him for moments like this. And if Santamaria thought this would be easy, he was about to learn the truth the hard way. The first light of dawn stretched across the horizon, bathing the fields in a golden glow. Manuel Rivas stood by the wooden fence, rolling a cigarette between his fingers. The morning air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and livestock. He had spent years on this land, working it with his bare hands, shaping it into something worth protecting. His life was simple but disciplined. Every morning he woke before the sun, fed the animals and checked the crops. The farm was small, but it was his, and that was enough. He had lost his wife years ago, but rather than break him, the solitude had made him stronger. Manuel was a man of few words, but his presence alone commanded respect. By midday, after hours of labor, he hitched his old pickup truck and drove into town. San Isidro was a small, bustling place where everyone knew each other. Vendors lined the streets, selling fresh produce, handmade goods, and warm bread. Children ran through the plaza, their laughter filling the air, while the older men gathered in the cafe to exchange stories. Manuel parked near the butcher shop and made his usual rounds. He greeted people with nods, exchanged a few words, and moved on. His reputation was well established. Hard-working, honorable, not a man to be trifled with. At the cafe, he sat at his usual table near the window, the scent of fresh coffee mixed with the crisp pages of an old newspaper. He sipped in silence, listening to the murmurs around him. "Another farm sold," someone muttered from the next table. "Rodrigo Santamaria?" another voice asked. Manuel's grip tightened on his cup. "They say he's buying up land to expand his horse-breeding farm," the man continued. "The last owner got a deal too good to refuse." "Or maybe he didn't have a choice," someone else whispered. Manuel had heard enough. He left some money on the table and walked out. He knew Santamaria's type, men who saw land as just another asset, another step toward power. But not this land, not his. The drive home was quiet, but his mind wasn't. He knew the businessman would come sooner or later. He didn't have to wait long. Just before sunset, the deep hum of engines echoed in the distance. Manuel looked up from his work and saw a trail of dust rising over the road. Two black SUVs approached, their polished exteriors gleaming under the fading light. They stopped just outside his fence. The doors opened, and out stepped Rodrigo Santamaria. The man was dressed in an expensive suit, a sharp contrast to the rugged landscape. He adjusted his cufflinks before flashing a practiced smile. "Señor Rivas," he greeted smoothly. "A pleasure to finally meet you." Manuel didn't reply. He wiped his hands on his jeans and stood firm. Santamaria motioned to one of his men, who handed him a folder. "I admire men like you, hard-working, determined. That's why I want to make you an offer." He held out the document. A very generous one. Manuel didn't even glance at it. "Not for sale," Santamaria chuckled. "Come now, everything has a price." "Not this." The businessman's smile barely faltered, but something darker flickered in his eyes. He exhaled slowly, then patted Manuel's shoulder with a forced camaraderie. "Think about it," he said, his tone carrying a veiled warning. "I'll be back." The SUVs roared to life, disappearing down the road. Manuel watched them go, his jaw tight. He had given his answer, but he knew this wasn't over. The days after Rodrigo Santamaria's visit passed in tense silence. Manuel kept working his land as if nothing had changed, but he knew better. Men like Santamaria didn't take no for an answer. They didn't negotiate. They conquered. One evening, as Manuel finished feeding the livestock, he noticed a dark plume of smoke rising in the distance. His stomach tightened. Dropping everything, he sprinted toward the fields. By the time he reached the crops, the fire had already spread. Flames licked hungrily at the dry stalks, devouring his hard work in minutes. The heat was suffocating, the crackling of burning plants deafening. He grabbed a hose, desperate to fight the blaze, but it was useless. The fire had been set with precision, too fast, too deliberate. This wasn't an accident. By the time the flames died down, a portion of his land was nothing but blackened earth. Manuel stood there, breathing heavily, hands clenched into fists. He already knew who was behind this. Rodrigo Santamaria had sent his message. The next morning, Manuel drove into town. He needed supplies to start rebuilding, but more than that, he needed information. At the cafe, the usual hum of conversation quieted as he walked in. People had heard about the fire. They gave him nods of sympathy, some whispering among themselves. Manuel ignored them and sat down. It wasn't long before he heard a familiar name. Héctor El Toro Gutierrez, an old man muttered at a nearby table. Manuel turned slightly, pretending to focus on his coffee. "He's been seen around here lately," another voice replied. "Word is he's working for Santamaria now." Manuel's grip tightened around his cup. He knew that name. El Toro was a ghost from a past he had tried to bury. A former soldier, ruthless and efficient, known for doing whatever it took to get the job done. If Santamaria had him on his payroll, it meant the businessman was done playing games. The message was clear. If Manuel didn't sell, worse things would follow. That afternoon, as he patched the damaged fences, Manuel sensed he was being watched. Years of instinct told him when eyes were on him. Casually, he turned his gaze toward the road. A black SUV sat parked in the distance just beyond his property line. It didn't move, didn't approach. It was a silent warning. Manuel exhaled slowly. He had lived through threats before, through men who thought power made them untouchable. He had learned the hard way that sometimes the only way to deal with such men was to remind them they could bleed. He wasn't ready to fight yet. But if Santamaria thought he would roll over, he was about to be disappointed. That night, Manuel sat on his porch, sharpening his old hunting knife. The rhythmic scrape of metal against stone filled the quiet air. He thought about his next move, about how far Santamaria was willing to go. One thing was certain. If the businessman wanted a war, he had chosen the wrong man to provoke. The sun had barely risen when Manuel Rivas stepped outside, his boots crunching against the dry earth. The air still carried the acrid scent of burnt crops, a reminder of the warning Santamaria had sent. But Manuel wasn't a man who scared easily. If anything, the fire had only strengthened his resolve. As he worked the land, something stirred at the edges of his mind. Fragments of memories buried deep, surfacing like echoes from another life. Images of dark corridors, whispered conversations in foreign languages, hands steady on the grip of a rifle. He shook his head, forcing them away. That was a different time, a different man. Later that morning, Manuel drove into San Isidro to buy supplies. The town was already awake, the streets alive with vendors and the scent of fresh bread wafting through the air. He parked near the general store, stepping out just as he noticed a woman watching him from across the street. She was striking. Shoulder-length dark hair, piercing green eyes, and an air of quiet determination. She wasn't from around here. Lucia Marquez, an investigative journalist, known for exposing corruption in high places. He had seen her name in newspapers before, tied to articles that had made powerful men very uncomfortable. She approached him with a small, knowing smile. "Señor Rivas, I was hoping we could talk." Manuel studied her for a moment. "About what?" Rodrigo Santamaria. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. Not interested. He turned, but she stepped in his path. "Then maybe you'll be interested in what I found out about him," she said, lowering her voice. "Santamaria isn't just a businessman. His horse breeding operation is a front. Money laundering, arms smuggling, land acquisitions through intimidation, you name it." Manuel exhaled sharply, eyes narrowing. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his blood simmer. Lucia continued, her voice firm. People who stand in his way disappear. You refusing to sell? That's not something he'll let go. Manuel met her gaze. I don't scare easily. I figured, she said with a smirk. That's why I came to you. That night, Manuel sat in his dimly lit kitchen, a glass of whiskey untouched on the table. His mind raced with what Lucia had told him, and then, as if summoned by his thoughts, the past crept in. A single phrase whispered in his memory. Operation Phoenix. The name alone sent a chill down his spine. He hadn't thought about it in years. It was supposed to have been erased, buried under classified files and redacted reports, but now, staring at the worn wooden table in his kitchen, Manuel felt the weight of it pressing down on him again. What had triggered it? Was it Santa Maria? The fire? The way this whole situation felt like something he had lived before? And then, as if fate had chosen that exact moment to remind him, an envelope slid under his front door. He stood up, heart pounding, and picked it up carefully. No name, no return address, only a single piece of paper inside. 4 words, handwritten in ink. They haven't forgotten you. Manuel's jaw tightened. Whoever had sent this knew who he really was. The past wasn't just whispering anymore. It was coming for him. Manuel sat at his kitchen table, staring at the cryptic note in his hand. The words felt heavier than the paper they were written on. They haven't forgotten you. His past, the one he had buried beneath years of quiet farm work, was clawing its way back, and it wasn't just whispers in his mind anymore. Someone out there remembered. Someone wanted him to know. He took a slow sip of whiskey, forcing himself to think. The fire, the threats, and now this. It wasn't a coincidence. The question was, who had sent the message? And more importantly, were they a warning or a threat? The next morning, as Manuel repaired a section of the fence, the sound of tires crunching against gravel made him look up. Another black SUV, but this time, Santa Maria came alone. The businessman stepped out, adjusting his expensive sunglasses, and approached with the same smug confidence as before. But today, there was no pretense of friendliness. You've had time to reconsider, Santa Maria said, his voice smooth but edged with impatience. Manuel didn't stop working. My answer hasn't changed, Santa Maria exhaled through his nose, as if tired of the game. I don't think you understand what's at stake. Manuel finally turned, meeting his gaze. I understand perfectly. A tense silence stretched between them. Then Santa Maria smirked. I admire stubborn men, but stubbornness without power? That's just foolishness. He pulled something from his jacket pocket and tossed it at Manuel's feet. A burned piece of wood, charred remains from the fire. A reminder, Santa Maria said, his tone casual. Next time it won't be just your crops. Manuel clenched his jaw, but he didn't react. He wouldn't give the man the satisfaction. Santa Maria studied him for a moment, then put his sunglasses back on. You have 48 hours to sell, Rivas. Then he turned and left, the SUV kicking up dust as it disappeared down the road. That night, Manuel sat on his porch, staring at the stars. He had spent years pretending to be someone he wasn't, a simple farmer, a man disconnected from the past. But deep down, he had always known the truth. Men like him weren't meant for quiet lives. The fire, the threats, the note, they were all warnings. But Manuel had never been a man who ran. Still, he wasn't foolish enough to fight alone. He needed to be smart. He needed an ally, and he knew exactly where to find one. Before sunrise, Manuel drove to an old ranch on the outskirts of town. The property was run down, the main house barely standing, but the place wasn't abandoned. A single horse stood tied near the entrance, and the faint glow of a cigarette flickered in the shadows of the porch. Carlos El Aguila Mendoza, an old friend, an old ally. Manuel stepped out of the truck, hands in his pockets. You still alive, cabron? A low chuckle came from the porch. Barely, Carlos replied, stepping into the light. He looked older, more tired, but the sharpness in his eyes hadn't dulled. What brings you here? Manuel didn't waste time. I need your help. Carlos took a slow drag of his cigarette, exhaled, then smirked. This about Santa Maria? Manuel raised an eyebrow. You already know? Carlos shrugged. I keep my ear to the ground. He flicked his cigarette away. And I figured one day you'd stop pretending to be a farmer. Manuel's expression didn't change. So, you in? Carlos grinned. I thought you'd never ask. Manuel nodded. The fight was coming, and now he wasn't alone. The morning air was crisp as Manuel and Carlos stood outside the ranch, the weight of unspoken history between them. They had fought side by side before, long ago, in places most people never heard about. And now, after years of pretending to be ordinary men, they were back where they belonged, preparing for war. Carlos stretched, cracking his knuckles. "So what's the plan, viejo?" Manuel exhaled, staring at the distant hills. "First, we gather intel. We need to know exactly how deep Santa Maria's operations run." Carlos smirked. "You always did love the slow approach." He walked toward a rusted metal cabinet near the stable, pulling it open. Inside, neatly organized, were weapons, old but well maintained. He grabbed a revolver and tossed it to Manuel. "Just in case you forgot how to use one." Manuel caught it effortlessly, spinning the cylinder before setting it down. "Some things you don't forget." Carlos chuckled. "Good, because this isn't just about your farm. Santa Maria has his fingers in everything. Land acquisitions, drug trafficking, political bribery. If we hit him right, we don't just protect your land. We take down his entire network." Manuel nodded. That was the goal. But first, they needed leverage. That afternoon, they drove to a small warehouse on the outskirts of San Isidro. Carlos had arranged a meeting with someone who might help, a former accountant for Santa Maria who had gone into hiding. The man was nervous, sweat forming on his brow as he sat across from them in a dimly lit office. "If Santa Maria finds out I'm talking to you, I'm dead," he muttered. "Then let's make sure he never finds out," Manuel said calmly. The accountant hesitated, then exhaled. "He launders money through his horse breeding business," he admitted. "But that's just the surface. He also moves arms shipments through the stud farm. Government contracts, high-level corruption. He's untouchable." Manuel exchanged a glance with Carlos. "No one's untouchable." The accountant swallowed hard. "I have documents, bank records, transaction logs, enough to bury him, but they're heavily encrypted." Carlos grinned. "Leave that to me." Later that night, they met Lucia Marquez in a secluded location outside of town. She leaned against her car, arms crossed as they approached. "I was wondering when you'd call," she said, a knowing smirk on her face. Manuel handed her a flash drive. "Everything we could get on Santa Maria's finances. Can you crack it?" Lucia raised an eyebrow. "If this is real, you just gave me the biggest story of my career." Carlos chuckled. "It's real, Carino, and it's just the beginning." Lucia's expression turned serious. "You do realize what you're getting into. Santa Maria has politicians, law enforcement, and an army of enforcers on his payroll. If you push too hard, he'll push back." Manuel's gaze was steady. "He already has." Lucia studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I'll work on decrypting this, but be careful. If he senses what you're planning, he won't wait to make his next move." Manuel's jaw tightened. "Neither will we." As they drove back to the ranch, Carlos glanced at his old friend. "You ready for this?" Manuel's hands gripped the steering wheel. "I was ready the moment he set fire to my land." Carlos grinned. "Then let's make him regret it." The battle had begun. The night was thick with humidity as Manuel and Carlos sat on a ridge overlooking Santa Maria's estate. The stud farm sprawled across acres of land, pristine white fences surrounding the property. But beneath its elegant facade, it was a fortress, a hub of corruption hidden behind the illusion of wealth. Through a pair of binoculars, Manuel scanned the area. Security was tight. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, their movements disciplined, well-trained. This wasn't just a businessman's estate. It was a stronghold. Carlos let out a low whistle. "You sure you don't just want to sell and retire somewhere warm?" Manuel didn't respond. His silence was enough of an answer. Carlos chuckled. "That's what I thought." The first strike was small, subtle, just enough to shake the foundations of Santa Maria's empire without drawing immediate suspicion. Manuel and Carlos sabotaged one of the smuggling routes used for laundering money. With carefully placed road spikes and a bit of misinformation, they redirected a truck carrying illicit cash straight into the hands of a rival cartel. The next morning, chaos erupted in Santa Maria's operations. At a high-end restaurant in the city, Santa Maria sat across from Hector El Toro Gutierrez, his enforcer, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean the money's gone?" Santa Maria asked, his voice deceptively calm. El Toro clenched his jaw. "The shipment was intercepted. Someone leaked our route." Santa Maria exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the table. "Find out who, and make an example of them." Meanwhile, Lucia Marquez had made progress on the encrypted files. She sat in her dimly lit motel room, the glow of her laptop screen illuminating her face. The deeper she dug, the worse it got. Offshore accounts, bribes to high-ranking officials, weapons deals disguised as livestock transactions. Santa Maria wasn't just a criminal, he was a kingpin. She picked up her phone and called Manuel. "I have enough to bring him down," she said. "Then we move to the next phase," Manuel replied. Lucia hesitated. "Manuel, be careful. He's getting desperate." Manuel glanced out at his farm, the scars from the fire still fresh in the fields. "So am I." The next target was a shipment of illegal weapons set to move through the stud farm. Manuel and Carlos watched from the shadows as armed men loaded crates into an unmarked truck. Carlos grinned. "I always did love fireworks." With a few well-placed charges, the explosion ripped through the night, setting the truck ablaze. The guards scrambled, shouting orders, but by the time they could react, Manuel and Carlos were gone. By morning, Santa Maria was furious. His operations were crumbling, his power slipping through his fingers. At his estate, he paced his study, while El Toro stood in silence. "This isn't random," Santa Maria muttered. "Someone is hitting us systematically." El Toro's eyes darkened. "It's Rivas." Santa Maria's hands clenched into fists. "Then it's time to stop playing games." That night, Manuel returned to his farm, exhaustion weighing on him. But as he stepped onto his porch, a chill ran down his spine. The front door was ajar. He reached for his gun, moving cautiously. Inside, the house was dark, eerily quiet. Then he saw it. His kitchen ransacked, papers scattered across the floor, and on the table, a single object, a bullet, a message. The war was no longer in the shadows. Santa Maria was coming for him. Manuel stood in the doorway of his ransacked kitchen, staring at the bullet left on the table. The message was clear. Santa Maria was done with warnings. The time for subtlety was over. He exhaled slowly, his mind already working through the next steps. If Santa Maria wanted to come for him, he would be ready. At dawn, Manuel and Carlos met in a secluded clearing outside town. Lucia was already there, laptop open, eyes tired but determined. "We need to move fast," she said. "I decrypted the last of the files. There's a deal happening at the stud farm tomorrow night. Big money, corrupt officials, and illegal arms shipments. If we get proof, Santa Maria is finished." Carlos smirked. "So we crash the party?" "Not just crash it," Manuel said. "We make sure Santa Maria doesn't walk away from it." That afternoon, Manuel paid a visit to an old friend, a high-ranking officer who owed him a favor. "I don't know how you got this," the officer said, looking at the documents Manuel handed him. "But if this is real, Santa Maria is going away for a long time." "It's real," Manuel said. "You just need to be there when the deal goes down." The officer nodded. "We'll be ready." As night fell, Manuel and Carlos approached the stud farm, moving like shadows through the fields. Through binoculars, they spotted the setup. Armed guards, luxury cars, and crates being unloaded. Santa Maria stood at the center of it all, shaking hands with powerful men who thought themselves untouchable. Carlos exhaled. "I count at least 20 guns on site." Manuel's eyes didn't leave Santa Maria. "Then we'll have to be smart." Lucia was in position outside the estate, her camera set up, capturing every detail. The evidence would be undeniable. Over the radio, she whispered, "Law enforcement is en route. 5 minutes out." Manuel gave Carlos a nod. "Time to set the trap." Carlos grinned, pulling out a small detonator. "I love this part." A distant explosion rocked the property as a truck outside the gates burst into flames. The guards panicked, scattering to investigate. Inside the estate, Santa Maria snapped to attention, barking orders. "Find out what's going on." That was their opening. Moving quickly, Manuel and Carlos infiltrated the compound, slipping through the chaos. Carlos disabled the security feed while Manuel made his way to the storage area. Inside, he found crates of weapons, stacked neatly, evidence of Santa Maria's true business. He pulled out his phone, taking quick photos. Then, a voice behind him. "Not bad, Rivas." Manuel turned slowly, finding himself face to face with Hector El Toro Gutierrez. The enforcer smirked, cracking his knuckles. "I was hoping for a chance to kill you myself." Outside, sirens wailed as law enforcement arrived. Lucia whispered into her radio, "They're here." Carlos grinned, watching guards scatter like ants. Showtime. Inside, Manuel and El Toro circled each other, the tension thick. "You should have stayed retired," El Toro taunted. "Now you die here." Manuel smirked. "Let's see you try." The fight was brutal. Fists, elbows, bone against bone. El Toro was strong, but Manuel was precise, methodical. Years of experience guided his movements. A well-placed strike to the ribs, a quick dodge, then a final, crushing blow to the jaw. El Toro staggered, eyes wide. He collapsed unconscious. Manuel stood over him, breathing heavily. "You talk too much." Outside, chaos erupted. Cops stormed the estate, rounding up Santa Maria's men. The businessmen tried to run, but Manuel was already waiting for him. As the police secured the compound, Lucia approached Manuel, holding up her camera. "We got everything." Carlos walked up, grinning. "So what now?" Manuel glanced at the horizon, the first light of dawn breaking. "It's over," he said. But in his heart, he knew the past never truly let go. The first rays of dawn painted the horizon as Santa Maria's empire crumbled. Sirens blared. Officers stormed the stud farm, and his men, once untouchable, were forced to the ground, handcuffed and powerless. Manuel watched from the shadows, his jaw tight. The job wasn't done yet. Across the estate, Santa Maria was slipping away. His polished shoes crunched against gravel as he rushed toward a black SUV, a driver waiting with the engine running. His perfect world was falling apart, but he still believed he could escape. Not this time. Manuel stepped onto the path, placing himself between Santa Maria and the vehicle. The businessman stopped short, his face contorting with rage. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "I have connections. I'll walk free before the week is over." Manuel said nothing. He had heard men like Santa Maria talk this way before, men who thought power made them invincible. Santa Maria scoffed, straightening his suit. "Killing me won't solve anything." Manuel's voice was calm. "I'm not going to kill you." A flicker of doubt crossed Santa Maria's eyes. From behind, police officers rushed forward. Lucia had made sure they had all the evidence they needed. Transactions, weapons deals, bribery trails leading straight to his name. Two officers grabbed Santa Maria, forcing his hands behind his back. "This is a mistake," he shouted. "I can buy every one of you." One of the officers smirked. "Not this time." As they dragged him toward a police van, Santa Maria's gaze locked onto Manuel one last time. There was no more arrogance, just the realization that, for the first time in his life, he had lost. A few yards away, Héctor El Toro Gutiérrez groaned as he regained consciousness. He had barely pushed himself to his knees when two more officers closed in, weapons drawn. "You move, and we drop you," one of them warned. El Toro clenched his teeth but knew it was over. His fists, his brute strength, none of it could save him now. As they dragged him away, Carlos clapped Manuel on the back. "Not bad, viejo. Not bad at all." Manuel exhaled, finally allowing himself a small nod. It was over. Hours later, back at the farm, the scent of burnt crops still lingered in the air, a reminder of what had been taken from him. But Manuel knew he had won something more important than revenge. He had fought not just for his land, but for the people who had believed in him, for those who had suffered under Santa Maria's greed. Lucia arrived as the sun began to set, holding a newspaper. The front page was dominated by a single headline: "Business tycoon Rodrigo Santa Maria, arrested in criminal operations scandal." She handed it to Manuel. "It's done. His political allies are cutting ties. He won't be getting out anytime soon." Manuel nodded, scanning the article. The truth was finally out. Lucia smirked. "I should thank you. This might be the biggest story of my career." Carlos chuckled. "You can thank us with a bottle of good tequila." Lucia rolled her eyes, but there was warmth behind it. "Maybe." As night fell, Carlos packed a small bag. "You're leaving?" Manuel asked. Carlos slung the bag over his shoulder. "Yeah, Santa Maria's just one piece of the puzzle. There are others like him." He gave Manuel a meaningful look. "You know that." Manuel did. Carlos smirked. "You ever get tired of farming again, you know where to find me." Manuel chuckled. "I'll keep that in mind." They shook hands, and with that, Carlos disappeared into the night, just as he had done so many times before. Manuel stood on his porch, watching the fields sway under the moonlight. His land was still his fight was won. But as he gazed into the horizon, he knew one thing for certain. His past would never truly let him go. And maybe, just maybe, he was okay with that. The night was heavy with tension. A storm brewed in the distance, flashes of lightning illuminating the darkened sky. The farm was quiet, too quiet. Manuel stood on his porch, his rifle resting against the wooden railing. He knew they were coming. Rodrigo Santamaria had been arrested, but his empire wasn't finished yet. His remaining men, those too loyal, too ruthless, or too desperate to give up, were coming for revenge. And leading them was Hector El Toro Gutierrez. Carlos had left, but Manuel wasn't alone. Inside the house he had prepared extra ammunition, reinforced doors, escape routes. He wasn't going to be taken by surprise. The first sound came from the distant road, a low rumble of approaching engines. Headlights cut through the darkness like sharp blades. SUVs, at least 3 of them. Manuel exhaled, tightening his grip on his rifle. It was time. The convoy stopped just outside the fence. Doors swung open and men poured out, armed, moving with military precision. Then, from the largest vehicle, El Toro stepped out. Even in the dim light, his massive frame was unmistakable. His knuckles cracked as he rolled his shoulders, eyes scanning the farmhouse with cold calculation. He took a step forward, his voice booming in the night. "Rivas, we know you're in there. Come out and we'll make it quick." Manuel didn't answer. He simply raised his rifle, lined up his sights, and fired. The shot shattered the silence, striking one of the gunmen. He collapsed with a grunt, sending the rest into cover. The battle had begun. Bullets tore through the wooden fence as Santamaria's men returned fire. Manuel ducked behind the porch railing, keeping his movements sharp and precise. He took another shot, one more down. Inside, a series of small, carefully placed charges detonated, setting fire to the barn. Smoke billowed into the sky, disorienting the attackers. Manuel had rigged it as a distraction. Footsteps, fast, coming up the side of the house. Manuel turned just in time, swinging the butt of his rifle into the face of an approaching mercenary. The man stumbled and Manuel finished him with a single, clean shot. More were coming. He needed to move. Darting through the house, Manuel triggered another trap, an old hunting trick. A wire snapped, sending a heavy wooden beam crashing down on the next attacker at the doorway. 2 left. He reloaded, breathing steady. Then silence. The storm overhead cracked with thunder, and in that moment Manuel felt it. El Toro was inside. A shadow moved near the back entrance. Manuel barely had time to react before El Toro lunged. They crashed through the kitchen, knocking over chairs, breaking furniture. Manuel struck first, landing a solid punch, but El Toro barely flinched. The enforcer grabbed him, slamming him against the wall. "How you should have taken the deal, viejo," El Toro growled. Manuel grimaced but didn't falter. "You talk too much." With a sudden movement, he twisted, freeing himself and driving his elbow into El Toro's ribs. The big man staggered just for a second, but a second was all Manuel needed. He reached for his knife. The final fight had begun. The kitchen was a battlefield of broken furniture and scattered debris. Manuel and El Toro circled each other, breathing heavily, their bodies already bruised from the brutal exchange. The storm outside raged, wind howling through the shattered windows. Lightning flashed, casting sharp shadows across the room. El Toro wiped blood from his mouth, grinning. "You've still got fight in you, old man." Manuel said nothing. He simply tightened his grip on the hunting knife. Then El Toro charged. Manuel sidestepped, slashing upward, a clean cut across the enforcer's forearm. El Toro growled in pain but barely slowed, swinging a massive fist that Manuel barely dodged. The 2 men crashed into the table, splintering it into pieces. El Toro was bigger, stronger, but Manuel had fought men like him before. He wasn't going to win with brute strength. He needed to be smarter. He waited for the next attack. Then he acted. As El Toro lunged, Manuel ducked, driving his knife deep into the enforcer's side. A sharp gasp escaped El Toro's lips. He staggered back, clutching the wound. His eyes, filled with disbelief, met Manuel's. "You bastard," he wheezed. Manuel stepped closer. "Stay down." But El Toro wasn't a man who knew when to quit. With a final roar, he swung wildly, one last desperate attempt to end the fight. Manuel dodged, one last clean strike, straight to the chest. El Toro's breath hitched, his body shuddered. Then slowly he collapsed to the floor. The fight was over. Outside, the storm reached its peak as the last of Santamaria's men scattered into the night. The farmhouse still stood, battered but unbroken. And then, sirens. The police arrived, led by the officer Manuel had spoken to. Armed units swept in, securing the last of the mercenaries. Lucia was already there, her camera rolling. She captured everything. The weapons, the destruction, the final pieces of evidence that would make sure Santa Maria never walked free again. Hours later, as dawn broke, Rodrigo Santa Maria sat in a high-security holding cell. He had lost everything. His empire was gone, his men either dead or in prison, his name now synonymous with scandal and disgrace. The headlines spread across the country. Business tycoon exposed as criminal mastermind. But Manuel didn't need to read the news. He had already moved on. Back at the farm, Manuel stood on his porch, the morning sun warming his skin. The land had survived, just like he had. Lucia approached, holding up her phone. "The story is out. He's finished." Manuel nodded. He had done what needed to be done. Carlos, freshly returned from wherever he had disappeared to, leaned against the truck, smirking. "So, what now?" Manuel glanced at the land, then at the horizon beyond. "I rebuild," Carlos chuckled. "That's it?" Manuel met his gaze. "For now." Carlos studied him for a moment, then grinned. "Well, if you ever get bored of farming again, you know where to find me." With a final nod, Carlos climbed into his truck and drove off, disappearing down the road. Lucia watched him go, then turned to Manuel. "And you? Are you really done?" Manuel exhaled, looking out at the rolling hills. "I've spent my life fighting ghosts. Maybe it's time to let them rest." Lucia smiled. "If anyone deserves peace, it's you." But as Manuel watched the horizon, he knew one thing. Men like him never truly left the fight, and if the past ever came knocking again, he would be ready. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across Manuel's farm. The air smelled of earth and rain, the scent of renewal. The scars of battle remained, bullet holes in the wooden fence, the burned patch of crops, but they were just remnants of a war that had finally ended. For the first time in years, peace felt real. Lucia sat on the porch steps, flipping through her notes. Santa Maria's assets are frozen. His allies are jumping ship. He won't be getting out anytime soon. She smirked. "You did it, Rivas." Manuel exhaled slowly, the weight of it all finally settling in. He had fought not just for himself, but for the people who had suffered under Santa Maria's greed. And now, they were free. Carlos had already disappeared, off to chase another fight, another mission. That was his way. But Manuel, he was staying right here. Lucia watched him for a moment. "You really think you can just go back to farming?" Manuel chuckled, shaking his head. "I never stopped." She smiled. "Well, if you ever get tired of the quiet life." He glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. "You'll be the first to know." Lucia laughed, standing up. "I'd better go. My editor is waiting for the biggest story of my career." Manuel nodded, watching as she got into her car and drove off, dust rising behind her. As night fell, Manuel stood alone on his land, feeling the earth beneath his boots. The ghosts of his past had been laid to rest, but deep down he knew peace was fragile, and if the past ever came knocking again, he would be ready.